So welcome everyone. So today we're going to start with the first of the isms of modern art that this course will cover. So much of modern art seems to be made by artists who belong to a group, the name of which ends in ISM, or else critics or historians have chosen to give such a label to them, even if they didn't initially call themselves by such a name. Fauvism and Cubism are both movements where that name was given by critics, and in both cases actually it's a slightly disparaging name to call the Fauves the wild beast. It wasn't a compliment. And to say that the Cubists they just make paintings full of little cubes or something, it's very reductive kind of labeling. But sometimes people take a negative label and make something positive of it. There's a lesson in life about that, I suppose. But Futurism is a little bit different in that that's a label that the artists themselves gave to themselves. So it was a self-conscious movement in that sense. Perhaps really the first self-consciously modernist avant-garde movement of the 20th century. It had a deliberate stance of rejecting the past. It had a sort of idea of the future. Now, of course, you could say in all sorts of different societies there was all kinds of changes happening because of technological innovation. But it's not a matter of pure technology when you come to talk about people's image of the future, image of progress. That's a matter of culture. They did have some sense of a future. Where is all this going? Sense that the future would be better. So although this course has the title Modernity and its Discontents, not everyone was discontented with modernity, and the Futurists were largely celebratory of the changes that were happening. That sense of modernity as... So I could make a distinction between the modern experience, which everyone is undergoing as society changes, and a self-conscious response to modernity, an attempt to sum it up culturally, in this case in art, which is what they were trying to do. Now, of course, Italy, they were Italian artists, I should emphasize. But Futurism is an Italian movement. And of course, Italy was not the first country to experience industrialization, industrial revolution. That famously happened in England, the invention of the steam engine, technology for mechanizing, spinning and weaving. All these were big developments that lead to industrial capitalism, first in England and other advanced states like in Germany and so forth. Italy was a little bit further behind. So there's no kind of determinism from life to art, that because life changes, art has to change. We didn't have Futurism in England, in other words, the first country. We had it in Italy, one of the later countries to come along. Well, why is that? Maybe it's because in a slightly later country to experience industrialization, the process may have been a bit more speeded up. You notice the process a bit more, you're aware of it because it's quite a transformation. You can have major transformations, but if they happen at a slow enough pace, you don't notice it. Like there's the story that you could boil a frog. If you had a frog in cold water and you gradually heated it up, the frog wouldn't notice that it was getting hot, and then eventually the frog would be boiled but hadn't jumped out of it as it would if it was in the hot water initially. I don't know if that's actually the case that frogs would be boiled. But you understand the principle of the story, that you're more aware of a change that's happening suddenly. And I think that's something we can understand in this part of the world, because there are many places in this part of the world where the pace of change is really rapid. Within one lifetime, people can go from being peasants working a field to living the most ultra modern life. There are some parts of the world that's even more extreme than that. Someone I knew who had been on an expedition to Papua New Guinea. He has a friend. She works in computing, so she works with very high level technology. But until she was a certain age, she'd never seen a wheel. Basically that's a very big technological shift from tribal life in Papua New Guinea to computing. So I think that's one of the reasons why it might have happened in Italy rather than somewhere else. And of course, Italy even today is a country where you're very aware of the past as a physical remain. If you go to a city like Rome, then there's the remains of the great Roman civilization, 2,000 years old, the center of a major empire in the world at that time. The ruins of that is still very, very visible, marks the fabric of the city even today, more so than some other ancient civilizations such as China. Of course, China has a continuity back as a civilization much older than that, but you don't necessarily notice it if you're wandering around Shanghai or something. You don't get that. It's not in your face in the same way as the Colosseum, say, or the Forum is in Rome. In terms of art, of course, the past is often thought of as a great thing in Italy, the Renaissance tradition, let alone the classical tradition. But for the Futurists, this was something to try to throw off. So they're consciously against the past. Again, that's not the same necessarily in every culture. If you look to Chinese modernism, there's a lot of artists who are interested in ink painting. They want to carry on that tradition in some way, even if they want to change it at the same time. It's not such a complete break with the past. So by modernism, as I said last week, one can basically talk about the Industrial Revolution, the development of industrial capitalism, industrialization, and then urbanization, which goes along with it. Those are the two great changes. Those changes in Italy, urbanization, industrialization, they happen much more in northern Italy, and maybe the city of Milan would be the main focus. Even today, you can see quite a difference in Italy between north and south. It's a long country, like, say, Vietnam is a long, thin country. So you do notice a difference in climate, apart from anything else, but also in levels of industrialization. There's a famous Italian film called Christ Stopped at Eboli. Eboli was, a town way down near the boot part of Italy. The idea was even Christ didn't go further than that. It was really so poor. In the film, it tells the story of that kind of place. So certainly, at the time of Futurism, the beginning of the 20th century, you have that strong sense of distinction. A mainly agricultural country, and then suddenly industry coming. There hadn't really been a strong Italian modernist tradition, not so much as in France or in certain other countries. I'll show you one or two examples of the kind of work Italian artists were producing before this time of Futurism, but there wasn't so much for them to draw on in terms of a native tradition, and they do draw on it where it exists to some extent, but I think it's fair to say the most important influence on Italian Futurism is French Cubism. that's not the whole story, because we'll see there's a sort of two phases of Futurist art. There's a phase before Cubism and a phase after Futurism. And what I'm going to do here, I'm not going to present it to you developmentally in terms of those two phases, but I think it'll be pretty clear to you what those two phases are as we look at the individual works, and I'll point that out. What I'm going to do instead, and it's not an approach I'll take from most lectures, but the approach I'll take here is to look at some of the themes of their art. So we'll start by looking at the theme of movement or dynamism, which they take to be a key trait of modernity. It's faster. Then I'll look at the trait of the subject matter of the city. Then I'll look at art which is concerned with subjectivity. That's in part a way to try and differentiate it from Cubism, which is not so concerned with subjective experience. And then the final theme I'll look at is violence. So movement, the city, subjectivity, and violence. Take a sort of subject matter approach rather than a developmental approach or a stylistic approach for treating them. You can ask the question, did they really understand Cubism even though that they were so influenced by it? Maybe that's a question to bear in mind as we look at things. It's a very nationalistic art, I would say, Futurism. Nationalism is something that, well, it's still very much alive today. You know, in China, for instance, the state mobilizes nationalist feeling very strongly to bind a population together, a very large and disparate population, to keep state power centralized, nationalist rhetoric, you know, putting a man into space or something like that. All these things, or Hong Kong going back to the motherland. All these things are all things that, you know, attempting to create a nationalist narrative. So Italian Futurism was very nationalistic. So there's something of a paradox that they were looking to French art for a lot of their stylistic resources. They're looking to something foreign to construct a material of nationalism. Of course, that actually happens a lot. Even the notion of nationalism maybe is, say nationalism in China. Nationalism was a sort of Western idea that was imported at the time of the 1911-12 revolution, you know, to create a sense of being citizens rather than just being subjects of an emperor. It was a sort of young man's movement, short-lived movement. Let's say it started around 1909, finished about 1915. The key artists involved are Umberto Boccioni, Carlo Carra, Luigi Russolo, Gino Severini, and Giacomo Balla. So I'll focus on those and mention one or two others along the way. But as I say, I'm not dealing with it artist by artist, which is an approach we'll often use. And there's another person I need to mention apart from the artists, and that's Marinetti. Marinetti. I'm sorry I don't have a whiteboard I can use in this classroom to write things up. Marinetti is a poet. Actually, Futurism starts with him. He's the sort of founder of it all, the key figure, the theorist of it. You could say Futurism starts with the literature and then moves to art. Marinetti wrote a foundation manifesto of Futurism in 1909, saying what it was going to be. It's almost like a manifesto that, in advance of the thing itself, it's already described what it's going to be. And the artists, to some extent, follow ideas that are there in the manifesto. We'll see that that's the case. The full text of that manifesto was published on the front page of the magazine, the newspaper, Le Figaro, French newspaper. That's quite a publicity coup. So they were quite good at PR before such a term was really in existence. They were doing it and succeeded in it. So there was this sort of public dimension. Nowadays in the art world, all this is very just normal stuff, but maybe not at that time. Let me read one or two things from that manifesto to give you a kind of flavour. I like to do this. I like to read artist statements and so forth, but I don't worry you can't get the whole of it. Just when it's just being read out at you. I'm not expecting you to be able to note it all down. I just want you to get the flavour of it all. And the flavour is, it's quite sort of violent in a way, the language. It is in Italy that we launch this manifesto of violence, destructive and incendiary, by which we this day found Futurism, because we would deliver Italy from its canker of professors, archaeologists and antiquaries. Italy has been for too long the great market of second-hand dealers. We would free her from the numberless museums which cover her with as many cemeteries. We will sing of great crowds excited by work, by pleasure and by riot. We will sing of the multicoloured polyphonic tides of revolution in the modern capitals. We will sing of the vibrant nightly fervour of arsenals and shipyards, blazing with violent electric moons, greedy railway stations that devour smoke-plumed serpents, factories hung from clouds by the crooked lines of their smoke, bridges that stride the rivers like giant gymnasts, flashing in the sun with the glitter of knives, adventurous steamers that sniff the horizon, deep-chested locomotives whose wheels paw the tracks like the hooves of enormous steel horses, bridled by tubing, and the sleek flight of planes whose propellers chatter in the wind like banners and seem to cheer like an enthusiastic crowd. So it's a sort of celebration of all of what was then modern technology, steam engines, aeroplanes and so forth. A naive acceptance, really, of the products of modern technology, no misgivings really about it at all. Cheerleaders for it. But I think there's something kind of advanced in their awareness. I mean, we might be a bit more skeptical. We're worried about nuclear power, or at least nuclear weapons. We can destroy ourselves now. We couldn't do that 100 years ago. We're worried about global warming that's caused by modern technology and effluence of that. I think it's sort of understandable at that point in time people didn't have so much worry. But I think there's something prescient about being aware that our whole experience of the world is going to change because we have these new technologies, rapid communication or transport and so forth. So let's go to the first theme. I'll just, before we start, just show you one example of the kind of work being made by artists in Italy before the time of the Futurists. And this is one of the comparison images that's on the back of the slide list. This is Severini, Punishment of Luxury, 1891. You could say that he's one of a group of artists who are influenced a bit by Seurat, the great French artist Seurat, S-E-U-R-A-T, Seurat, who introduced the sort of pointillist or divisionist style, where he puts together little dots of quite pure colour side by side on the canvas, and then from a distance those blur together with creating a sense of greater luminosity. It started with this desire to represent light. Well, some Italian artists like Severini are interested in that. But the subject matter is different. You could call it a kind of symbolist subject matter, a concern with the inner world, or the world of the imagination. Sort of the image of these women sort of floating around. The idea is that they are bad women, they've lived a bad life, and so after their death they will go to this sort of state of limbo, in between place, where they were, it's a sort of punishment, the punishment of luxury, as the title says. Okay, so the first work by one of the actual Futurist artists, Elasticity, from 1912 by Bacio Knee. So movement is the subject. We could say movement, or we could say dynamism. Of course, it's a horse and rider moving, the actual subject. But it's not so much about how to represent a particular thing that is moving. It's more about the abstract principle of movement. Hence, maybe you just use a term like dynamism as a way of talking about movement in a more general, abstracted sense. One thing we'll see is there's a sort of movement in the representation of movement from more realistic approaches to more abstract approaches. The attempt to represent motion forces them towards a greater abstraction of style. The topic of movement turns out to be something that is really difficult to deal with in a realistic representational style that has been inherited from the Renaissance tradition. Modern artists don't become different in their style just because they want to have a show-off novelty or something like that. Would be a rather shallow explanation, a rather shallow motivation. Usually people change their styles because they can't say what they want to say in the existing style. They need a new style to say something new, and with modern life changing, there are new things to say. Modern life is becoming more dynamic. And how can we find a language to deal with that? I have a bit to say about that when I look at the different artists. So this is already one of the works that dates from after the encounter with Cubism. Cubism, we saw last week, for example, I showed the portrait of Vola, I think, wasn't it? And it had a fragmentation of a human figure, adding together information from different viewpoints, which is how we actually see the world. That kind of fragmentation is adopted here, the breaking things down into planes. But the Cubists themselves didn't really take that innovation as being something to represent movement. They would largely, Picasso and Braque, be concerned with static subjects, a seated human figure, or a still life on a table, but they would take slightly different viewpoints on it. But the Futurists, already the logic is in there. If you can add information together from different viewpoints, you've introduced a kind of time dimension into art, and you could be moving around. It could be you, the artist, is moving, or it could be the subject is moving. Inevitably, you are adding together information from more than one viewpoint, even if you're standing still, because your eyes may be moving, or your eyes have to move to represent the whole scene in front of you. Your head would probably have to move. Even if your eyes didn't move, you have two eyes, so you're adding together information from more than one viewpoint. But the principle is already there of movement. So it's not a big step further to represent an object that is moving through this sort of fragmented vocabulary of planes. It's an innately difficult thing, how to represent something moving on a static flat surface. It's an innately impossible task to do so, and it helps to break down realism. Hence a style such as this. In the they were very. I made a couple of quotations from the first 1909 Manifesto of Cubism. Here's one more that deals with movement. Marinetti says, "We declare that the world's splendour has been enriched by a new beauty, the beauty of speed. A racing motor car, its frame adorned with great pipes like snakes that have explosive breath. A roaring motor car, which looks as though it was running on shrapnel. It's more beautiful than the victory of Samothrace." So modern technology is more beautiful. Its product is more beautiful than a work of classical art, famous work of classical art. Apart from that initial manifesto, there were further manifestos that the artists themselves were more involved in. So this is from the Technical Manifesto of Futurist Painting. This is 1910. It says, "Our bodies penetrate the sofas upon which we sit, and the sofas penetrate our bodies. The motor bus rushes into the house as it passes, and in their turn the houses throw themselves upon the motor bus and are blended with it." It's saying everything is in motion, and a consequence of that is everything is connected to everything else. What you see in this image is the breaking down of boundaries. That's there in Cubism too. You're linking foreground and background. The landscape you're moving through and the thing moving through the landscape are somehow kind of connected together. It's Bacio Knee saying, "For us the gesture will no longer be an arrested moment of universal dynamism. It will clearly be the dynamic sensation itself, made eternal. Universal dynamism must be regarded as dynamic sensation." I mean, actually what I'm trying to get at here is it's not just speed as a phenomenon of the modern world. Actually, in a sense, these kind of new paintings, and we'll see sculptures too, represent a whole way of thinking about reality, one which emphasizes dynamism and interconnectedness. Actually, it's not even specifically modern. It's maybe fairly relatively unusual in the Western context, but say in a Buddhist context, it's not so unusual to emphasize the connectedness between things. There's the Buddhist saying, "Shi shi wu ai." There's no gaps between things in reality. We think of things as separate, but actually there's no outlines around things, except in drawings. Paintings maybe have outlines, but reality doesn't have outlines. Bun lai wu yi wu. And originally there are no things. It's just something we've invented, the idea of thinking each thing is separate. So I think Futurists is trying to find their way towards some sense of the connectedness of things. I want to say a style implies a worldview. There are some styles you have to abandon a certain kind of style because that's not the way you think the world really is anymore. Maybe a realist style represents the world as too static and too separated out into different things, and that's not fundamentally how you see the world. Remember, this is a time in the beginning of the century when science is doing something similar. Science is stopping presenting a picture of the world that fits our everyday common sense of, this is this thing, this is that thing, and they're all separate. Instead, science is starting to say, well, actually everything is dynamically interconnected. Most of it's empty space anyway, and it's all atoms whizzing around, electrons whizzing around, protons or whatever. It's a sense of dynamism and connection. And I think the Futurists were aware of those changing scientific ideas, Einstein, relativity. and so forth. More so, say, than the Cubists. I don't think the Cubists were trying to illustrate scientific notions of relativity when they break down the idea of a single mastering viewpoint that has been there in Renaissance, in Western art since the Renaissance. But I think maybe the Futurists were much more aware, and they were aware of the ideas of the philosopher Bergson, a very, very popular philosopher at that time who is now less well thought of, perhaps. Bergson, Bergson. Bacio, for example, studied his ideas. Here's Bergson talking then about the nature of reality. He says, does not the fiction of an isolated object imply an absurdity, since this object borrows its physical properties from the relations which it maintains with all the others, and owes each of its determinations and consequently its existence to the place which it occupies in the universe as a whole? Everything is connected to everything else. Any division of matter into independent bodies with determined outlines is artificial. Our sense of separate things is only a provisional thing. Reality is not really like that. So why should artists paint things with nice, definite outlines around them? That's the implication if you're an artist. Well, for Boccioni, he's made important contributions as a painter, but also he worked as a sculptor. And this is his most famous sculpture, and possibly the most famous work of Futurism altogether. So the unique forms of continuity in space, 1913. It's perhaps his most accomplished work and his most famous work. And there's a period when really he's only working in sculpture. I showed you the work of Segontini, an Italian painter who preceded the Futurists. I'd like to show you the work of a Italian sculptor who preceded them. This is Medardo Rosso, Rosso, Rosso. Boccioni really admired his work. He says, in his sculpture there are no heroes and no symbols, but the planes of the forehead of a woman, or a child which betrays a hint of spatial liberation, will have far greater importance in the history of the spirit than that with which he has been credited in our time. He wasn't that particularly famous at that point in time, but obviously better known in Italy than elsewhere. Rosso's idea of sculpture is not so much to be concerned with the skin of reality, to reproduce the exteriors of things, but it's more to do with essences. He works in a solid material, but the distinctive thing about his style is the way he adds wax over the top. So the actual surface you're seeing is wax. And you can see a kind of blurring of one form into the other. Sometimes people have called this a kind of impressionistic quality of sculpture. And I think that although the style is not the same as Boccioni's, you can see how this interesting connecting one form to another, not thinking of it, the two figures as completely separate, would have been an influence. Of course, there's maybe a metaphoric dimension here, talking about the emotional bond between mother and child, the closeness and so forth. One of the characteristics of Boccioni's sculpture, well, there's the same fragmentation of form that we, again coming from Cubism. The Cubists made sculptures too, as we saw in the painting, the Elasticity. in the since it's a three-dimensional object, that means breaking down solid form. That's really innovative within the whole history of sculpture. A lot of, you make a bronze sculpture, of course it's not solid metal, it's hollow, because that would be very expensive and also difficult to do. But opening out those interior spaces, creating a sense of empty space within or between the forms of the sculpture. All this is really new. One or two Cubist sculptures had done that kind of thing, but this is really at the forefront of everything. So in terms of the stylistic language of sculpture, this is really moving ahead. Strong sense of movement, well, not just movement, I would say progress. This is very, it's a representation of purposeful forward striding. This is not tentative in any way. This person knows where they're going. They're going forward, and that's a good thing. The relationship to the base is interesting. There's a sort of doubling of the base. Each foot has its own separate base. Well, they're joined at another level. But all this is kind of unusual. These kind of things here, it's not like he's trying to show you one moment of the figure, actually. It's not like a frozen photograph of a figure in motion. He's showing you maybe different phases of a figure's motion. There's a sort of blurring effect of really creating a sort of streamline or sense of motion somehow. You're aware of all the forms also emphasize not the skin of the figure so much as the muscles underneath, the muscular energy, which is important to creating this sense of forward movement. We're not looking at surfaces so much as what is underneath those surfaces. And this is a drawing kind of obviously related really to this idea of a figure moving forward. We get that same idea here, almost like a kind of the touches are sort of dissecting or like like a surgeon's knife cutting into the flesh, not concerned with the beauty of the surface of human skin or something like that, a kind of impressionist approach to life, where impressionists are concerned with the skin of reality, what it looks like. Here we're sort of cutting through that. So again, you have this in this drawing, this sense of emphasis on muscularity beneath the surface, even more so here, I think. These sort of forms here, yeah, you can explain them as something to do with motion, or giving a sense of more than one state of the body's position. You could also say that it's to do with representing a clothed figure. This could be clothes flapping in the wind, or in the motion of the figure causing it to move around. That's another way of looking at it. Actually, Boccioni didn't like the idea of the nude, so the clothed figure would interest him, because the nude is so evocative of classical art, classical Roman and Greek art. It speaks of the past, and therefore it's something we want to leave behind, really. So not trying to deal with surfaces, but to deal with something underneath. Here's another example of his sculpture. While we're looking at it, here's another. So development of a bottle in space, 1912 to 13. So this is a still life. It's a very unstatic subject matter. The previous two examples I've been showing you, the elasticity and unique forms of continuity in space, they're both examples of figures in motion, a horse and a human figure in motion. Here's something static. But so it shows, the example shows you that Futurism is not just concerned with merely representing moving things. its interest in dynamism is somehow deeper. So even a static object like a still life of a bottle can be turned into a dynamic image. Again, like the previous sculpture we were looking at, we're seeing solid forms broken open. So the bottle is kind of broken open. We see the interior of it. Well, here is an indication of the front side of the bottle. Modern artists are often happy just to give you a few cues. They don't need to tell you every detail of an object like a realist artist. Realist artists to the modernist way of thinking, a realist artist could be like a little child. You say, well, what did you do today? Oh, the child might give you a long story, and then we did this, and then they can't summarize. They can't necessarily work out what's the important bit. They'll tell you, but a modern artist will say, well, the audience is smart. I don't need to tell them everything about the bottle. They know it's a bottle. They've got the idea that it's a bottle. Just trust them. And now we can get round to the idea of making a sculpture. It's about forms. It's not just about bottles. It isn't a bottle, actually. If you want a bottle, go get a bottle. If you want a sculpture, here is a sculpture. So opening out those forms creates interesting voids as well as solid, a dialogue between solids and voids. That's a more interesting visual, formal property, and it allows him to create these, dynamic forms. It's almost a sort of spiraling kind of unfolding. Even to be making a sculpture of a still life in the first place is pretty unusual. Still life is a normal subject for art. It's a genre of Western art, and even in Chinese painting, there's sort of kind of equivalence to it, I suppose, of paintings with rocks and things, flowers and that. But not in sculpture, in painting. It's not a genre of sculpture at all. Sculpture is, in the Western tradition, you can say, has been very limited in its subject matter. It's mostly been about the human figure. That's really limited. It's only in the modern period that you start to see sculpture having a greater diversity about what it will deal with. So still life sculpture, well, this we're looking at here, the beginnings of that. And it's a very unusual, deconstructive or revolutionary beginning for still life in the world of sculpture. Boccioni says, each object reveals by its lines how it would be decomposed according to the tendency of its forces. Talks about a desire to break open the figure and enclose the environment in it. So this is the kind of thing that we're seeing here. Moving on to another artist, this is Bala. Gradually I'll introduce the different Futurist artists. I think you can see his approach is a little bit different to representing the theme of movement. We're still with this first theme, the theme of movement in Futurist art. And maybe his approach, I don't know what you will feel, but maybe you'll find his approach a little less interesting than Boccioni's. It's a bit more literal-minded. It's a bit more about representing actual motion, things in motion, rather than an abstract notion of dynamism. Clearly something that has played a part is the influence of another art form, namely photography. The development of photography especially as photography develops, the speed of photography changes. So photography starts by this point in time to have the ability to freeze motion. The long exposures that were necessary at the beginning of photography didn't allow that. You get very static poses and so forth. But we're starting to get those effects. even effects that you might think of as failures in a photo. Oh, it's all blurry, but well, it's interesting, we think about that. A painter can think about that. Artifacts can become something that can be exploited aesthetically. So, Bala, Dynamism of a Dog on a Leash, 1912. The dog's legs are repeated again and again, its wagging tail again and again to create the sense of motion. The leash also is in motion. This is from the technical manifesto of Futurism, 1910. All things move, all things run, all things are rapidly changing. A profile is never motionless before our eyes, but it constantly appears and disappears. On account of the persistency of an image on the retina, moving objects constantly multiply themselves. Their form changes like rapid vibrations. In their mid-career. Thus, a running horse has not 4 legs but 20. Well, you could see a statement like that. It can easily be read onto a painting like this. Here's something very similar Bala's doing. Hand of the violinist. Interesting thing here perhaps is the unusual shape of the painting.
Yeah.
That, of course, adds another kind of dynamism to everything. It's a more realist approach in a way than Boccioni, but to represent motion almost pushes you towards abstraction. That's what we'll see happening in his case. He becomes one of the pioneers of abstract art in a way. He's a bit older than the other futurists. He's a whole generation older, really. So it takes him a little bit of time to kind of come along to what they're doing, because he's got something to give up, to change. He's already got an established style, and he has to agree to let go of something in order to grasp something new. The others are young artists. They're grabbing the first thing that this is the first style basically for them. There's nothing to lose, nothing to give up. Flight of Swifts, 1913. Yeah, you can see it starting to get more and more abstracted. It's the same notion of a sort of multiple exposure, if you like. But by repeating the form of the body of the Swift, then it starts to become just an abstract form in its own right. There was some phenomenon on the web, it's probably still up there and on YouTube or whatever, where people thought that maybe they discovered some new creature. It looks like a long thing with little sort of flapping kind of wings on the side of it. And they thought, oh, here's some sort of prehistoric creature that survived or something like that. But of course, actually, it was an artifact of photography. It's what insects or something look like when they're videographed at the appropriate speed. They look like a long thing with kind of flapping, undulating. Anyway, it's quite interesting if you find it on the web. But that's a sort of example of people not understanding how modern technologies transform the look of things. I think that the name for them was rods that they gave. And some people spend a lot of time trying to capture images of them. Then eventually Bala ends up here, where it's pure abstraction, you could say. Iridescent interpenetration, 1912. So it's one of the earliest abstract artworks. And colour is an important part of creating that sense of mobility. So he's really, it took him a while, but at the end he got somewhere quite interesting, really quite radically different. It's a different solution to Boccioni. Boccioni never went to this kind of abstraction. Abstract art has there's no one road down which everyone went towards abstraction. It's abstract art had many different beginnings and many different pathways, so there's more than one pioneer. Bala becomes one of them. Well, I mentioned already how photography offers some advice on how to represent motion. On the one hand, photography seems to be a medium for producing perspectival images. It's almost the beginning of photography is almost like, here's a tool that can make realistic images even more perfectly than the human hand could. You know, the British pioneer of photography, Fox Talbot, he talked about trying to make drawings on his honeymoon. He tried to make some drawings, and he talked about the faithless hand, the hand not quite doing quite what he wanted it to do, not being perfect in its representations of the scenery he could see in front of him. So the camera becomes a tool for getting the hand out of the way and making it more perfect. But the very tool that kind of was to complete realism actually helps to undermine realism, because you start to be aware that there's a time dimension in the exposure. So photography starts to make you think about time. Some photographers, like this one, Muybridge, start to explore the possibility of how do you represent or capture motion by stilling it, freezing it. Paintings never froze motion, but photography did. So Muybridge took whole sequences of photos of animals and human figures in motion to try and capture, well, what is the gait of a human figure in motion, or the gait of a horse? So motion starts to become an object for visual investigation in a way that it never had before. So all this is very interesting to the Futurists and indeed other artists of that time. As the technology of photography develops, so new things are possible. This is the photographer Mary, M-A-R-E-Y. He developed a sort of what you could call like a camera equivalent of a machine gun. You know, it can just take lots of photos one after the other in very rapid succession, and then capture motion, very fast motion, all in one image rather than a sequence of images like Muybridge. These little dots you see here, that's all to do with little little kind of torches that are attached to the body to give out light, so it sort of marks lines of motion. And that's one of the influences that produces these sort of abstract lines of force, sometimes they're called in Futurist art. The blur of motion. Yeah, this is Mary actually trying to represent the motion of birds, so this is really particularly close to what Bala did in The Flight of Swifts. But then photography perhaps can't go to that greater level of abstraction that painting finds possible, you know, in a work like this. Each medium has its own possibilities. Blur is only there in photography, it's never there in painting. But actually a whole lot of 20th century painting, in one way or another, is painting after photography. So sometimes you do see blur in painting. A lot of painters will use photography as a practical tool. You know, you can't have someone sitting in front of you all day long every day, but you can take some photos of them. But it's also at a deeper level, photography has really influenced how we look at the world. We're so used to looking at photographic static, well, I should say images from a camera, static or moving images. So it determines our mode of thinking about the world, our way of looking at the world. So a lot of artists are influenced just in that way. I'm sorry, this slide, for some reason, this slide title is listed twice on the side list. I don't know why. And this is a futurist artist who himself used photography as his medium. Bragaglia, Image in Motion, 1913. So exploiting the possibility of blur in the long exposure of a photo in order to create a way of capturing motion. So photography is not just influenced by, Futurism is not just influenced by photography, it actually makes use of photography. I hope you don't mind, because we lost a lot of time at the beginning, I think I'm just going to plough on through, but if someone needs to go to the toilet, please please do, don't feel embarrassed to leave the room. Someone who's interested in motion but isn't actually a futurist. We can't really talk about this theme without mentioning Marcel Duchamp, the French artist. This is his Nude Descending a Staircase. So this is a 1912 version. There's a bit of a question about who did what first, because he's doing something very close to what the Impressionists have done. He must have been aware of what they were doing, and the Futurists had come to Paris in the autumn of 1911. But on the other hand, Duchamp's interest in motion had started before that time, even if this work was not finished before that time. Futurist work was shown in Paris, before he finished this work. February 1912, I think. But Bala, the futurist we just looked at, whose approach to motion is the closest to Duchamp's solution, wasn't in that exhibition. So a little bit hard to work out exactly who did what first. So Duchamp is a Paris-based Cubist artist, closer than the Futurists were to where that language of Cubism and its fragmentation form was developed. So it's almost inevitable to try and explore the possibilities of representing motion. Someone was going to do it. And you see these sort of little lines of dots here. That's a little bit like those lines of dots in the photographs that we've seen, Mary's photographs. He's obviously been looking at the photographs as well. So in some sense it's the same sources coming into play. The staircase seems to be sort of coming down a sort of zigzag way. So the figure is sort of turning slightly around as it comes down. It's a nude, which he didn't have the hang-up of Bacio Knee of not liking the nude because of his association with the past. There isn't in his work this sort of link between motion and modernity. He's not making motion into a kind of symbol of that which is modern. That's one distinction between them. And just to look at this whole issue of how motion is represented, going back in art history, for those people who say, "Oh, this modern art is all rubbish," painting a dog with 20 legs, that's nonsense. Dogs only have 4 legs. What a load of rubbish this modern art is. Well, just to show you, Leonardo also painted a horse with many heads, and people who attack modern art usually don't also attack Leonardo. They usually don't think that sort of thing is okay. So the same problem is there. How do you represent motion in the static world of painting? Well, you could say drawing is just a sort of note to himself about how to represent a horse. But it also captures in a vivid way the sense of the horse's head moving around, the horse's legs moving around. I think it's a lovely representation of motion. He also he's very interested in moving water as well. How do you understand the flows of water? Many drawings he made trying to understand what are the patterns in water's motions. The 18th century British artist Stubbs, showing horses galloping. Well, this is how, not just Stubbs, but all artists of that time tended to represent a galloping horse with two legs out the back and two legs out the front. That was kind of what people thought horses' legs did when they moved. That's how they were, the convention for representing motion. And it wasn't until photography by Muybridge was able to capture the motion of the horse that actually they discovered there isn't a moment when all four legs are splayed out and off the ground at the same time. Maybe there is a moment when all four legs are off the ground of a galloping horse, but it's when the four legs are gathered up together underneath the horse. So here's an example of Degas drawings of horses in motion that was made after Muybridge's photographs and learning from them. Part of this dialogue between art and photography. So the Futurists are just taking things one step further, really. It's part of, I'm trying to say it's part of a larger story and part of this bigger problem of how do you represent motion in the static world of art. Even in other cultures, the same question comes up. Of course, in Indian art, Shiva dancing, the multi-armed nature of a god, it's partly to represent the power of the god, able to do many different things at once, but it also creates this sense of the movement of a dance. Motion is also evoked. A more recent sculpture representing motion in time is Rodin, the most famous sculptor of that age, Rodin's Walking Man. He makes a sculpture about motion by getting rid of the head and arms. He often dealt with fragments in his sculpture. But part of what's going on here, getting rid of the head and arms, focus you on the issue of motion. Focus you on the legs. When people criticize him, saying, well, why is there no head, no arms? He said, well, you don't walk on your head. This is a sculpture about walking. His solution is not to freeze a moment of motion of a walking figure. Both legs are actually quite solidly placed on the ground. So again, he's sort of adding together two moments of motion to represent the idea of motion. Already it's a kind of synthetic idea. It's just the Futurists have their own slightly different synthetic idea. So I'm trying to say they're not that different in a way. And they're dealing with similar issues. Duchamp again, we come back and look at his work in his own right later on, but I'm giving you a sort of preview of his ready-mades when he actually used real objects, took them into the art gallery, objects from life, and took them into the art gallery world. This is his bicycle wheel. So, yeah, you could actually spin that wheel. They won't let you do it if you go into the gallery nowadays, but in theory it's still spinnable. So here we have actual motion coming in. See him representing motion, the new going down the staircase. Here we actually have real motion. But that's a sort of cheat solution in a way. It doesn't solve the question of how do you represent motion. Even film doesn't solve that problem. Film represents motion, but it does it by just tricking your retina. It just moves a sequence of static images past your retina so fast that you can't see the gaps, joins between them, and your mind sort of blurs them all together and imagines it seeing motion. But a film is made of static images too. It hasn't solved the question of representing motion any more than painting has. You actually physically move the film through the camera to create the sense of motion. It's real motion, not represented motion. Same as the motion of this wheel would be real. In the 1960s, there's a moment in 60s, 70s maybe, there's a moment in Western art particularly that you start to see exploitation of this property of actual motion as and its aesthetic properties. So this is just one example, Paul Bury, 1914 White Point, 1964. There's a motor behind the surface that gradually, almost seems in a slightly random way, moving these little wires with dots on the ends around. It makes it feel slightly alive. You can't predict the motion. It's not like a sort of clockwork mechanism where you can get the idea of how what's going to happen next. It's got an unpredictable quality to it. A sense almost of aliveness to it. So I'm trying to put Futurism within this broader trajectory of concern with motion. And yeah, photography can freeze motion. That's no one before the invention of photography had ever seen motion frozen. It's a part of the modern experience of how we see the world. To see motion stilled. This is perhaps Henri Cartier-Bresson's most famous photograph. He talked about trying to capture the decisive moment in photography, the one moment that explains the larger sequence. In a sense, all art all painting had to deal with that question. How to represent when you're telling a story, which moment is the most telling moment in that story to represent. This is just the second before his foot splashes into the water. Okay, back to the Futurists themselves. I took quite a big detour there to give you a larger context within which to think about Futurism or what it's doing. Back to introduce another example of the Futurists that we haven't met so far. Severini, the Blue Dancer of 1912. Unlike that Duchamp image, there isn't really this sense of a sequence over time of the nude coming down the stairs. We get a sense of motion, but we can't reconstruct the whole sequence. But yeah, we have a sense of a dancer. He's used actual sequins on the surface of the painting representing her dress, almost like a kind of pointillist dot from the style of Seurat coming back into the painting. And recalling the use of collage in later Cubism, where they stuck actual objects into their painting. We saw last week an example of a newspaper representing a newspaper, and the Cubist collage work by Picasso. Severini was a bit out on a limb compared to the other Futurist artists in that he was based in Paris. They visited Paris, but they were based in northern Italy. He, therefore, is more connected in with a sort of Parisian sense of modern life as involving, the world of entertainment. This has been a big subject in French art from the time of the Impressionists. Degas, for instance, Toulouse-Lautrec, these are artists who are very interested in the world of leisure. Impressionists, big subject of Impressionism is the leisure of the middle classes. So a very leisurely, spontaneous style of painting too. So Severini is picking up on things which are very common within the world of the city in which he's living, the art of the city in which he's living. Nightlife scenes. This whole idea of making art that tries to capture modernity comes from the idea of a French writer, Baudelaire, the French poet, who he wrote a very important essay called The Painter of Modern Life, and wrote various other things on a similar theme, where he talked about how beauty isn't eternal, as some people would say. According to his view, each age has its own particular quality of beauty. So an artist can't just try to do something transcending time. The artist will only succeed in capturing beauty if they also capture what is specific to that age. So such an idea influenced artists like Manet, trying to capture the particularities of your own time. So this is an idea still here for the Futurists. It's human movement here, not mechanical movement or anything, but it's all part of the same story. And then with Severini we find the same thing. Actually these are two works from the same year. You're seeing him moved almost to pure abstraction. It would be hard to imagine this without looking at certain Cubist works that also, have this sort of fragmentation of planes. At one point, Cubism becomes very hermetic, very difficult to decipher forms. The original Cubists, Picasso and Braque, when that happens to their work, after a certain point, they come back to more recognizable art. But other people don't have the same scruples. So Severini's pushed through towards a greater sense of dissolution of form. It's not about the literal subject matter. It's about, and maybe it's not about solid form. Solid form is not the most important thing. Dynamism is a more fundamental characteristic of life, according to this worldview. So maybe you're representing light, energy. Scientists are starting to talk about energy instead of just matter to a greater degree. Energy is sort of made equivalent to matter almost. E equals mc squared and so forth. Another artist I haven't introduced yet, Russolo. Dynamism of an automobile. So actually it's a modern thing that is moving in this case, rather than a horse or a human figure. An automobile. Not that they moved quite so fast in that time as they do today, but still it would have seemed fast. The earliest automobiles, they had someone walking in front of them with a flag to warn people and things like that. It took a while before things really speeded up. But everything is relative, I suppose. It's important all the time as a historian to capture a sense of how things have changed. I mean, an automobile is a kind of commonplace thing to us, but we're talking about a world where the streets were full of horses, and then suddenly you have these internal combustion engines appearing. The streets were full of all the mess the horses left behind and everything as well. It's a different world. Electric light is something new. The city at night. Well, an electricity supply was new, let alone electric light. All the things we take for granted. So much of our world was new. So it's, of course, interesting to artists to try to represent them. In Russolo, you have some attempt to show you the actual vehicle, but then he also wants to abstract, try to represent motion through these more abstracted forms. So moving on to the second theme I want to look at, the theme of the city. Bacio, going back to 1908, to one of his early works, so have a sense of his development over time. Since with the theme of movement, I jumped straight to his Futurist work. Here I'm showing you a slightly pre-Futurist work, where you still see the influence of Seurat. And actually here is a Seurat painting to compare to, just a small sketch, if you like, by Seurat. A Seurat painting showing a kind of, well, it's the modern city is not just the ceremonial part of the city, the downtown area, it's also the suburbs and the industrial areas. That's distinctive of the modern city. A 17th century city was never anything like that, let alone a medieval or Renaissance city. A city with little gaps in between. You get that with Bacio, you know. The city is actually going up before our eyes. Some things, see the scaffolding, some things are being built, other things are still empty wasteland. It's not like a mature city that's already been finished. Again, for those of us in this part of the world, it's easier to understand that nature of city life. You know, we live just across from Shenzhen. That was just fields a generation ago. Suddenly it's one of the world's largest cities, you know, major metropolis. Or a lot of Chinese cities that they're expanding, you know, an extra ring road is being built or something like that. It's growing. Sometimes it'll grow so fast that farmers' fields are still left inside the city. The city has rushed past them, and only later will those fields suddenly become another part of the development of the city itself. So that kind of slight unevenness, something Bacio has picked up, the sense of the city growing unevenly, awkwardly in a way. Capturing it, I think, in a work like this. So the city not as something static, but as something dynamic. I'm breaking down into these different themes, like dynamism and the city. I've just moved to the latter, but already I have to say I'm still with the theme of dynamism. The themes overlap in different ways, and that's one difference, you know, between their representation of the city and earlier artists, is the emphasis on change. Probably the most well-known of Boccioni's early paintings. This is The City Rises. So this is 1910. This is an example of his style, a good example of his style before the time of Cubism, the discovery of Cubism, and how that transforms the language, gives them a language through which to represent modernity. Here he's trying to represent modernity with a language that's derived from artists like Segantini or Seurat. Maybe also Bala, you know, because Bala, as I was saying, was a generation older, more established. He learnt things from Bala too. So what is happening? We're seeing a construction site, even more so than the previous Bacio. We're having the sense of the city as some happening, a process, not a thing, happening before your eyes. Horses are being used on a construction site. Horses and human muscle power are constructing a city. You see scaffolding, you see buildings going up in the background. Where are we? We're down in a sort of depression of a construction site. We've got a very low viewpoint. We're down below the horizon. That helps to get us involved with the action. We're up close to everything. The horses, the workmen wrestling with a horse. You get a sense of the energy of the horse. It's almost out of control. Those workmen trying to power its, control its energy. we still talk about energy in terms of, measure energy in terms of horsepower. You know, how many horsepower is that engine, you know? Yeah, but in this time people were still thinking directly in terms of forces. So there's a slight paradoxical quality to our eye maybe to represent modernity through horses, but I think to someone of that time it wouldn't have seemed that way. The horse has this harness on it, you know, you're harnessing the energy of the horse, this big sort of yoke over the horse's back. But I think that it's been exaggerated by Bacio Knee. Almost becomes like a sort of wing-like form, doesn't it? So it's like the horse is becoming a quasi-mythological animal, like the Pegasus, the winged horse. It's realistic in a sense as an image of modern city life, but he's adding this kind of mythic connotation, at least, to the image. Light is very important, you know, going back to the stylistic resources of Seurat, adding quite pure colours side by side in a broken way that are then meant to merge at the appropriate distance in your eye to create a greater sense of luminosity. But that's divisionism or pointillism as a technical means, but I think it also becomes a sort of stylistic means to create a sense of dissolution of form, a sense of dynamism at the level of the brushstroke. It's almost like a kind of mirage-like quality about it. When he was writing about this work, he calls it a great synthesis of labour, light and movement. The immense horses symbolise the growth and the desperate labour of the giant city thrusting her scaffolding towards the sky. So much about what makes it succeed are stylistic choices about, you know, creating these diagonals or whatever. It's not what is represented so much as how it's represented. I mean, that's the great sort of insight of the futurists, is that modern life requires new modes of representation. You can't just go on doing the same thing. It's new experiences, so we need a new language for that. Simultaneous Vision, 1911. A woman stands on a balcony looking down on the city. There's a sort of fragmentation of viewpoint, as we find in Cubist art. Picasso and Braque, the original Cubists, they tended to focus on portraits of still life, things that are closer to you. So although there was a fragmentation of viewpoint, it didn't seem so dynamic and disorientating. They tended to move away from landscape as a subject because of the deep space of landscape that would create a disorientation if you're bringing together different viewpoints. Other Cubists like Delaunay or Léger, they were quite happy with that and used landscape and were happy to create a greater sense of dynamism. And the Futurists also go along with that. So you have this sense of, you know, if you were on a balcony, you'd have to move your viewpoint around to take in the whole scene, looking up, looking down, looking left, looking right. The people in the foreground of the painting, especially the figure in front of us, it's like a sort of substitute for us within the painting. A doubling of our presence within the painting, because we have a back view. The painting is about looking. We are looking at a painting in which a figure is looking. It's a painting about the city as a spectacle. You know, that's a common, you know, like if you go to watch the light show at 8 p.m. from Kowloon Side, you know, every night there's a light show. That's Hong Kong skyline turned into a spectacle, the city as a spectacle. Aestheticizing of the modern city. Oh, look at the skyscrapers and everything. Well, this is a similar kind of aestheticizing gaze on the city and the city in transformation. it's almost like a reverse to what we saw in the previous painting, The City Rises, where there we were down in a building site looking up. Now we're up above it looking down, but we're still seeing a building site. There are completed buildings around, but there's also new things about to come here. This is when this was exhibited in the catalogue of their exhibition in Paris. Bacio wrote, "The dominating sensation is that which one would experience on opening a window. All life and the noise of the streets rush in at the same time as the movement and the reality of the objects outside. The painter does not limit himself to what he sees in the square frame of the window, as would a mere photographer, but he also reproduces what he would see by looking out from every side from the balcony." I mentioned the French Cubist painter Delaunay. Picasso and Braque, they're not concerned so much with landscape, and they're not concerned with representing the modern city directly. But Delaunay is one of the Cubists who is. So here's one example of his painting of a distinctly modern structure, the Eiffel Tower. Boccioni had seen Delaunay's work, so that's one of the influences. Picasso and Braque had a contract with a dealer that in which that dealer agreed to buy every painting they produced at a fixed price, so they could survive without exhibiting in all the public exhibitions. Their work was less directly influential on artists visiting from other countries as a result. So if you went to Paris and you wanted to see what Cubism was, maybe Delaunay would be the artist you'd be more aware of than Picasso and Braque. It's only with historical hindsight we are aware that actually it all started with Picasso and Braque. So here is a sort of post-Cubist phase, pre-Cubist and post-Cubist phase of Boccioni's representation of the city. Bala, as I said, he's really a generation older than the other artists. I'm going back, this is probably the earliest work I've shown you by any of the Futurist artists. We're going back to 1908. Well, it's one of the earliest anyway. Yeah, maybe it's joint earliest that we've looked at, 1908. Stairway of Farewells. Actually, this already looking forward to the next theme I want to introduce, the theme of subjectivity. It's not just about the city, it's about our emotions in relation to the city. In a modern city there's much more comings and goings, separation. In a static world of a village, you know everybody, you've known them all your life. A stranger is an unusual thing. In a city, most people are strangers. You can be up close to strangers on public transport. People you don't know, their bodies can be pressing against your body. You can see someone who's immensely attractive, and the next moment they're gone. Just glimpse from a tram or something like that. All these the different emotions are configured in a different way to how they would be to your emotions in growing up in a village or something like that. Poets and artists have tried to capture all this. So, saying goodbye on a stairway. It's still at this point in his early point in his career, he's still working in a very realistic way, but within the constraints of that, he's created this immense sense of dynamism of this stairwell of a tall modern building spiraling downwards. But as I say, it's also about separation. Looking up, looking down. These are kind of perspectives. In a village, do you look up and down at people? No, maybe not. Maybe you just look across at people. here's a painting by Baudelaire that this is starting to become really a sort of problem. How do you represent a sense of the city as dynamic, as changing over time? The Workers' Day, 1904 to 7. Actually, it took a while over this because it seems to be a work where he's dealing with a transition. How do you show the city changing over time? A building under construction. Well, maybe you can slightly indicate that by showing different times of day. The Workers' Day. Well, morning, from morning light to evening light. Wow, and it's even got a street lamp, so some kind of modern form of light from of an urban environment, not just the light of the stars. Maybe they stop for their lunch or something like that. Different times of day. So sense of passage of time, which is another aspect that's always there with dynamism, a sense of bringing time back into art. Realistic art of the Renaissance tradition eliminated the sense of time in art. It always showing, if you have a unified space, you have to have unified time too. So if you break down unified space, you're allowing time to come back into your world. But he can't quite go for a full Cubist fragmentation. This is before Cubism, after all. He doesn't have that language to learn from. So he's carefully put a frame within the frame to break the canvas into three, to give him a sort of permission for the different areas to be separate, different times of day, different lighting schemes. He needs. You can see him needing a modern vocabulary, but not quite being there yet. A need arises, but the means has not yet come. Bala representing a street lamp, an electric lighting, artificial lighting. Yeah, one of the big ways in which northern Italy moved ahead. Yeah, if you have to leave, yeah, please go. I'm just going to carry on a few more minutes because we lost so much at the beginning. I'll try to get it back a little bit. One of the reasons why northern Italy became industrialized more than the south was that they had hydroelectric power. There's all the mountains of basically the Alps in northern Italy could use as a source of hydroelectric power. So Milan have these electric street lamps. So this work of 1909 is showing something that is really new. The first electric street lamps in Rome was 1904. That's the capital city. And really here he's deliberately putting this contrast between the modern industrial city and the old forms of night light, the moon. The moon is kind of eclipsed by the power of the street lamp. This is pre-Cubist, of course, 1909. So the language is developed from the divisionism of Seurat, the pointillist style of Seurat, fragmented dots of colour, although he's turned it into this unusual kind of hook-like thing, gives a greater sense of dynamism. It's pretty abstract in a way. Who before has tried to represent this kind of corona of light at night from a street lamp? How do you represent, sources of light anyway? You can't paint the brightness of the sun. You can't even look at the sun. You can't paint the mobility of a candle. What can you do? We're at the limits of representation, and that's what modernist artists have discovered, that realism doesn't work. It has its limits. That's the detail for you. Just briefly, Severini representing modern life, and like I say about his dancer image, it belongs within the typical subject matters of the modern city of French painters is very much a sort of in the style of Seurat. And then Cubism comes along, and he has this greater sense of abstracted dynamism. But it's still the modern city as a place of leisure. It's not the construction of the city like Bacio Knee is interested in. It's not emphasizing technological modernity or the transformation quite so much. It's more the world of leisure, modernity in a more general sense. This is the Boulevard of 1911 by Severini. Okay, maybe we should stop there. That's enough. But so I was thinking I'd try to get to the end of talking about the city, but I don't think I can do that. I'll keep you for too long. So we'll carry on looking about the theme of the city, then subjectivity, then violence. So I'm okay with this idea of starting fairly leisurely at the beginning of the course, go fairly slow, we'll take our time because there's some sort of background issues to fill in. It's the first time we're looking at modern art maybe for some people. So we take our time and we gradually we'll get our pace going over the weeks. So I don't mind that we spend some of next week also looking at Futurism. But then I think we'll have time to start looking at abstract art, which is the next big theme I want to introduce. And we'll start by looking at the work of Kandinsky, the Russian artist. So we're in Italy now, and then we'll move to Russia. We'll move around a little bit. So that's looking ahead what we'll see next week. So thanks very much.